Well, as Netanyahu was speaking on Sunday, thousands were again taking to the streets of Jerusalem and other Israeli cities, calling for his resignation and the release of all hostages in Gaza. Now, the protests are still ongoing. The Israeli Prime Minister met with the family of one of the hostages on Sunday. The father of 19-year-old Naama Levy told Israel's army radio that they left the meeting, quote, disturbed and with no good news. Nadav Salzberger from the Change Generation movement is leading the Tel Aviv protests, and he told the UK's Telegraph newspaper on Sunday that the protests over the weekend were, quote, an eruption of underground currents that have reached the boiling point. And he joins us now live from Jerusalem. Great to see you, Nadav. Thank you so much for taking the time today. Look, over the weekend, we saw an eruption of anti-government protests across many parts of Israel. But your specific movement is calling for something very specific. I want you to take me through what you and your members want.
Thank you. So first of all, I want to start by mentioning the 134 hostages still held captive in Gaza, including women, elderly, and children. We are fighting and praying for their immediate release. We are a movement called the Change Generation. After October 7th, we realized that Netanyahu and his coalition have no intent of taking responsibility over the worst disaster in Israel's history. So we have taken to the streets and we formed a young movement comprised of young Israelis, reservists, and students with the goal of replacing the current government with a responsible government, one deserving of the Israeli people. That is our goal.
So you're calling for elections and a change in government, essentially?
Yes. Yeah, we're calling for election.
Over and above, of course, importantly, and the release of hostages, which is important. But you've also said something interesting, and just reading up about what your movement is about, that Netanyahu hasn't prioritized hostages. So what do you think he has prioritized instead?
I think that Netanyahu has prioritized the survival, his own political survival, and the survival of his coalition. I think that while many people, including politicians, are doing their best to try and bring back the hostages, it simply isn't enough. I think that we, as the young generation who grew up under Netanyahu, have witnessed rotten leadership, and it's time for us to step up and demand better leadership for all Israelis.
So Netanyahu has rejected calls for elections, saying that it's going to dismantle the talks that are currently underway, specifically for hostage release. We also know that Hamas has said that all hostages will be released if there's a sustained ceasefire. So what are your views on the current negotiations and, importantly, on a ceasefire?
We believe that the war against Hamas is a just war. We believe that Hamas is a threat not only to Israelis, but also to Palestinians, and that Israel must triumph over Hamas. That is why we are not calling for a ceasefire. We believe that the war needs to be fought until the end, but we also believe that we should prioritize bringing back the hostages, even if it means pausing the same way we paused a couple of months ago to bring back hostages. And we also believe that declaring a schedule for elections a couple of months from now will not hurt or damage neither the war efforts or the efforts to bring back the hostages, but rather allow the current government to act without being dependent on politics or its own survival.
Yeah, I mean, and of course, families of hostages, we've heard just harrowing stories of the uncertainty that they're experiencing. I want to turn now to the UN Security Council resolution that within it said that famine is setting in Gaza right now. You know, from what we've been seeing and Netanyahu's policies essentially of not allowing enough aid into Gaza has gotten a lot of criticism from aid organizations. They're describing dire realities. From your perspective, how are you viewing this? And does this worry you and your members, importantly?
again, I think we are worried for our future in Israel, for the future of the region. I think that what we have seen yesterday in Jerusalem are hundreds of thousands of patriots going to the streets and demanding a better future. I think we are done waiting for politicians to make things better. I think that we need to make them better, and that we, the young people in Israel, are the generation that will bring change to the region and to Israel. Yeah, and I think that I know that we plan on continuing our protest.
All right, Nadav Salzberger, great to have you on. Thank you for taking the time. CNN is also learning that senior US and Israeli officials will meet virtually today to discuss Israel's proposed ground offensive in Rafah. A US official says the two sides are still working towards an in-person meeting on the issue. Face-to-face talks were abruptly called off last week by the Israeli Prime Minister after Washington refused to block a UN resolution calling for a ceasefire in Gaza. Benjamin Netanyahu says US pressure will not stop an Israeli ground operation in Rafah.
We will go into Rafah and eliminate Hamas battalions there for one simple reason. There is no victory without entering Rafah, and there is no victory without eliminating Hamas battalions there.
All right, well, talk's back on, and I want to head to Washington now and bring in CNN's Natasha Bertrand. Natasha, I want to get into, what the US has repeatedly said, and it's warned Israel about a siege into Rafah. In this virtual meeting aimed at Netanyahu, do you think that he's going to be able to convince the US that they have a workable plan? Can the US be convinced of a Rafah operation?
Well, the answer is that it really depends, because as of right now, the U.S. is extremely skeptical, and they have been urging Israeli officials, including in talks with the Israeli defense minister last week, to come up with an alternative plan, one that is not what the Israelis have been planning, such as a large-scale ground operation into Rafah that could endanger the over 1 million Palestinians that have sought shelter there over the last few months. And what the Israelis are saying is that, look, we need a way to eliminate these remaining Hamas battalions. And the U.S. is responding, well, you could go after them with a more targeted approach, something that targets more senior figures in Hamas rather than going in and doing an all-out assault. And so I think what the U.S. is still waiting to see from the Israelis is a concrete plan to move those civilians out of the area. And that is something that Israel has not been able to provide them with yet. And until they provide some kind of blueprint for how they're going to get those people out of that area, perhaps allowing them to move back north, then the U.S. is really not going to be on board with this. Now, among the proposals the U.S. has given to the Israelis is to ramp up talks with the Egyptians to try to seal that border so that Israel can conduct these more precision operations targeting these senior Hamas leaders without the possibility that they're just going to then escape, of course, across the border into Egypt. Of course, another aspect of this is that really targeted operation that the U.S. says that the Israelis should try, and that's something that they have been pushing them to do for months and months instead of doing these large-scale operations that really do endanger the civilians there. But the Israelis are going to do what they're going to do, and that is the message that we got last week in talks with Israeli officials, is that they are going to do what they believe is best for eliminating the remaining Hamas battalions in that area. Now, whether there are any consequences for the Israelis ignoring the Americans' advice, that remains to be seen, because we have seen that the U.S. has continued to provide them with weapons, with intelligence to help them prosecute this war against Hamas. And so the question now is, are there any red lines here? If the Israelis do move forward with this operation in Rafah, how is the U.S. going to respond, especially if it's in a way that the U.S. has explicitly advised against? Eleni.
All right, Natasha Bertrand, great to have you on. Thank you.